Oscar Piastri's exasperation with McLaren has ultimately hit a critical threshold following one of the most perplexing qualifying sessions of the campaign. And now fresh evidence has unveiled precisely why the Australian was left so bewildered in Mexico City. Approaching the weekend, Piastri was still commanding the championship and discreetly optimistic that McLaren's MCL39 would execute impressively at elevation. But as the sun descended over the Autodromo Hermanos Rodriguez, the harsh truth struck powerfully. While Lando Norris produced a magnificent pole position that transmitted shockwaves across the paddock, Piastri was left shaking his head in bewilderment. Trapped 0.6 of a second behind his colleague, the instant Norris emerged from the car with a grin and the mechanics exploded in jubilation, Piastri's side of the garage became quiet. What ought to have been another standard qualifying transformed into a catastrophe that revealed McLaren's most alarming vulnerability and left their championship frontrunner questioning everything. Behind the composed demeanor, Piastri was noticeably disturbed. He'd driven aggressively, felt the car conducting predictably, and was convinced he'd assembled a solid lap. Yet when the times illuminated on the large screen, it didn't compute. The deficit to Norris was massive, not merely for colleagues, but for two title contenders in identical machinery. It's a puzzle, he acknowledged afterwards, and that puzzle rapidly evolved into anxiety. How could a car that felt balanced and reactive be so dramatically off the tempo? The telemetry, the information, even his own intuition pointed in conflicting directions. And McLaren's engineers maintained there was no defect, no destruction, no concealed complication. But the proof from the session communicated a contrasting narrative. Piastri's MCL39 simply wasn't producing the identical assurance or grip through critical corners, particularly in the slower segments where Norris dominated. What renders the circumstances even more theatrical is how substantial the stakes are. With Norris on pole and Max Verstappen launching just ahead in fifth, Piastri's 7th position feels like a setback not only to his ego, but to his championship aspirations. He recognizes that every forfeited 10th, every squandered opportunity could shift the title momentum away from him, and the intensity is escalating rapidly. The exasperation isn't solely about the lap duration, it's about command. For the first instance all campaign, Piastri senses like the car is determining his execution rather than reacting to it. It's a nuanced but essential distinction, and one that distinguishes champions from challengers. Now, as McLaren rushed to comprehend what malfunctioned, pressure is discreetly accumulating behind the curtains. The information indicates the car is acceptable. The driver claims something's not correct, and the outcomes support him. The so-called fresh evidence today. The configurations in telemetry demonstrating irregular rear-load transition and inconsistent tire reaction has only intensified the mystery inside the squad. Some suspect it's just a setup misalignment. Others dread it's something more profound in the car's balance philosophy. Whatever the reality, one element is evident. Piastri's exasperation with McLaren has never been more apparent. And with Norris now spearheading the offensive, the championship confrontation is about to become extremely personal. Oscar Piastri's exasperation with McLaren has been accumulating for weeks, but in Mexico City it ultimately reached a critical juncture. What ought to have been a standard qualifying session for the championship leader transformed into an uncomfortable public deterioration of confidence, velocity, and faith between driver and car. The numbers were impossible to disregard. 0.6 slower than Lando Norris, who charged to pole position and nearly a complete second adrift of the caliber of lap Piastri, understands he's capable of delivering. For a driver who's constructed his reputation on composed precision and relentless consistency, the outcome was more than disheartening, was profoundly perplexing. The MCL39 simply didn't react the manner it should, and fresh evidence from within McLaren has commenced to reveal just how significantly off-balance the car genuinely is. The initial indicators emerged from the telemetry. On documentation, everything appeared standard. No defects, no mismatched components, no alert signals from the sensors. Yet concealed in the information were minuscule inconsistencies that communicated a contrasting narrative. Under deceleration, the load transition wasn't linear. It fluctuated, prompting the rear tires to forfeit stability precisely as Piastri was rotating in. Through the high-velocity S's, throttle implementation was more refined than Norris's, but slower. A signal that Piastri didn't trust the rear to adhere. It wasn't a mechanical malfunction, but a psychological one. When a driver commences to question the car's responses even marginally, lap duration drains away. That's been the developing theme of Piastri's recent few races. Since Austin, where a collision with Norris left both cars damaged but seemingly operational, the Australian hasn't felt completely synchronized to the MCL39. The engineers maintain the chassis rotation, procedure where components are exchanged and examined. Between races eliminated any structural concerns. But what the information can't quantify is confidence. And confidence is what Piastri has forfeited. He described the car as reasonable but not rapid, a phrase that conceals a deeper exasperation. When the car feels acceptable and the duration still isn't present, the problem transitions from the garage to the driver's consciousness. The deficit to Norris in Mexico wasn't an isolated incident. It was the latest segment in a pattern. Across all three segments of qualifying, the variance between them hovered around half a second. Piastri's laps were pristine, disciplined, and technically sound, but they lacked hostility. Norris attacked the corners, prepared to risk the car snapping out. Piastri couldn't afford to, not when the rear already felt on the threshold. The high altitude of Mexico City magnified that distinction. With 25% less air density than most circuits, the cars forfeit enormous quantities of downforce, compelling drivers to depend on mechanical grip rather than aerodynamics. Norris flourishes in that unpredictability, dancing the car through the corners. Piastri, smoother and more calculated, found himself pursuing a front end that never materialized. The onboard cameras made the contrast agonizing to observe. Norris flicked the car through the final sector, correcting mid-corner with small, assured inputs. Piastri's steering was neat but tentative, the variety of driving that appears composed but conceals a deficiency of trust. His engineer's radio messages were composed but abbreviated. The inflection of a driver who recognizes he's missing something he can't quite pinpoint. And when he emerged from the car, his expression communicated everything. He'd fulfilled his obligation. And it still wasn't sufficient. Behind sealed doors, McLaren's engineers labored late into the evening analyzing every conceivable variable. Tire pressures, suspension rigidity, brake bias, aero load. Nothing emerged as a perpetrator. Andrea Stella publicly announced that there was no evidence of a car complication, but internally the discussion was more intricate. The team's aerodynamic simulation suggested that the MCL39 is exceptionally responsive to minuscule modifications in ride height and yaw angle, signifying that a slightly contrasting driving input can alter how the airflow attaches to the rear wing and diffuser, a design peculiarity that accommodates Norris's rapid, aggressive rotation but penalizes Piastri's cleaner inputs. Essentially, two drivers, one car, and two vastly different outcomes. That distinction has commenced to configure the championship dynamic. Norris, now on pole, suddenly possesses the momentum and assurance of a driver who senses in harmony with his machine. Piastri, meanwhile, finds himself grappling with something intangible. How to extract velocity from a car that no longer conducts the manner he anticipates. His words after qualifying carried the burden of someone pursuing clarity. Being that distant off when you sense like you've executed a reasonable assignment is a challenging place to exist, he stated, and for once, the usually composed Australian sounded uncertain. From the team's viewpoint, there's no alarm, but there is pressure. The deficit between the two sides of the garage has broadened, not just in lap duration, but in atmosphere. Norris's mechanics are energized, assured that the balance they discovered is golden. Piastri's crew, however, are submerged in analysis, pursuing invisible problems. The more McLaren maintains the car is acceptable, the more isolated Piastri senses. It's a hazardous psychological cycle. The driver starts questioning himself. The team insists everything's standard and every session transforms into a test of conviction rather than execution. The danger for Piastri is that his composed exterior might conceal how proximate he is to forfeiting that crucial sense of flow. Confidence in Formula One isn't about arrogance. It's about understanding precisely what the car will execute before it executes it. Once that's vanished, you start reacting instead of anticipating. And that's when tenths transform into seconds. The telemetry demonstrates it distinctly. More delays in throttle pickup, slightly delayed turn-ins, micro-corrections at the apex. It's death by data, a gradual deterioration of instinct prompted by uncertainty. In championship terminology, Mexico could prove pivotal. Norris's pole signifies Piastri now confronts the genuine possibility of forfeiting the advantage he's maintained since early spring. A 15-point fluctuation would tilt the standings and perhaps more significantly shift the psychological equilibrium within McLaren. For months, Piastri has been the team's quiet commander, the methodical force maintaining their title charge steady. Now, with Norris resurgent and Verstappen advancing, that foundation is commencing to fracture. Yet, even in exasperation, there's resilience. Piastri understands this variety of setback defines careers. He's already redirected his focus to the launch to that extended drag down to turn 1, the longest of the calendar. If he executes the departure, he can reclaim ground rapidly. But the genuine battle won't be with Verstappen or Norris. It'll be with himself. He needs to rediscover the trust that once rendered him unstoppable to bridge the deficit between what the car indicates and what he senses. McLaren may assert there's no defect, but somewhere in that orange machine lies a disconnect only the driver can resolve. As the darkness falls over Mexico City, McLaren's data squad continues to dissect every millisecond, pursuing clues. The new shocking evidence uncovered in their internal analysis indicates minor fluctuations in rear ride height during load transitions, minuscule movements that can unsettle the car's aero platform, just sufficient to drain velocity. It's not a smoking gun, but it's a lead. And for Piastri, it's something to grasp onto, as right now, conviction might be his most valuable performance enhancement. Tomorrow, when the lights extinguish, the air will be thin, the tension thicker than ever. Piastri will position on the grid understanding that the numbers communicate one thing, but his intuition communicates another. And in Formula One, intuition can secure or forfeit championships. Whether he can transform exasperation into fire will determine not just his race, but possibly the trajectory of McLaren's entire campaign. If Norris triumphs again, while Piastri diminishes into the midfield, that exasperation might just explode into something McLaren can no longer conceal.